Donald Trump's trade wars, some Atlanta-based companies are now braving the storm.
Coca-Cola CEO says the price for a Coke might be going up. The reason, Trump's 25% tariff.
I'm refusing to buy anything from them, even if it's miniature carrot. I changed up the package.
Coca-Cola is facing an extra $200 million a year in cost. Not because of a supply shortage, not because of a labor strike, but because of a single policy decision. In early 2025, the Trump administration imposed a 50% tariff on imported aluminum, a metal used in every soda can, beer can, and soup tin lining U.S. shelves. For Coca-Cola, which depends heavily on aluminum packaging, the math turned brutal overnight. Material costs spiked. And now the ripple effect is heading straight for American wallets. The Can Manufacturers Institute has already warned consumers will feel it. That means your next grocery trip might cost more, not just for soda, but for anything sealed in a can. And this is just the beginning. What started as a tariff is now quietly unraveling an entire industry.
We strongly regret the announced increase of U.S. tariffs on steel imports from 25% to 50%. This decision adds further uncertainty to the global economy and increases costs for consumers and businesses.
One price hike at a time. Coca-Cola may be the headline, but it's far from the only casualty. Campbell Soup, one of America's most iconic pantry brands, has already sounded the alarm warning investors that aluminum tariffs are pushing production costs up at an unsustainable rate. PepsiCo is facing similar stress. And for craft breweries, the situation is even more dire. Many of these smaller beverage companies rely entirely on canned products. They don't have the luxury of global scale or billion-dollar buffers. When the cost of aluminum surges, there's nowhere to hide. And the consequences are starting to show. Across the industry, executives are being forced to make ugly choices. Do they raise prices and risk losing customers? Do they cut jobs? Do they close plants? The Can Manufacturers Institute has already issued a clear warning. Consumers should expect price hikes on everything that comes in a can. That means soda. That means soup. That means beer beans and even baby formula. But the pain doesn't end at the checkout aisle. According to a Federal Reserve study of previous steel tariffs, policies like these have a track record. They increase costs, shrink margins, and ultimately lead to net job losses across the manufacturing sector. And it's happening again quietly but undeniably. Across the country, factories are freezing hiring plans, cutting worker hours, and in some cases, laying people off. Some small producers are even exploring emergency workarounds, switching packaging, renegotiating supply contracts, or slashing product lines altogether. But there are limits to how much you can cut before a business simply breaks. This was never just a tax on metal. It's a chokehold on a sector that touches nearly every American household. And what began as a policy on paper,
I think firstly it comes back to the business model for the Coca-Cola company,
is now playing out in real time on paychecks, price tags, and production lines nationwide. While American companies were caught off guard by the 50% aluminum tariff, Canada saw an opening and quietly stepped in. At first glance, it might seem like Canada is just another trade partner, but the numbers tell a different story. As of 2025, Canada supplies 44% of all aluminum imported into the United States, far more than any other nation. And here's the key: when aluminum is both sourced and used within Canada, it doesn't trigger U.S. tariffs. That loophole is now turning into a lifeline for companies trying to survive the fallout. For Coca-Cola, which depends heavily on Canadian-sourced aluminum to produce its cans, the situation is turning quickly into a strategic pivot. Facing an additional $200 million in annual costs, the company is now actively exploring whether relocating production north of the border might be the only viable way to protect its margins. And they're not alone. Across the beverage and canned goods industries, companies are watching, recalculating, and quietly reconsidering their geographic footprint. And Canada. They're not just sitting back and waiting. The Canadian government moved quickly, launching the Tariff Loan Facility in early 2025 to help large enterprises restructure supply chains in response to U.S. trade policy shifts. At the same time, Canada doubled down on negotiations with the European Union and Mexico, creating more flexibility for businesses that want to avoid tariff chaos entirely. But it's not just financial incentives. Canada brings real logistical advantages to the table deepwater ports that feed the U.S. Midwest, a reliable rail system that connects coast-to-coast, abundant hydroelectric power, and most critically, a stable trade and regulatory environment. While the U.S. government sends conflicting signals, Canada is positioning itself as the quiet, reliable neighbor where long-term planning still makes sense. Now, smaller U.S. firms, the ones that don't have Coca-Cola's deep pockets, are looking north too. For them, this isn't about building billion-dollar plants, it's about survival. Some are seeking partnerships with Canadian co-packers. Others are moving warehousing and final stage assembly across the border to shield themselves from tariffs. A few are even discussing cross-border production pipelines, where raw materials flow north, get processed, and return south untaxed and on time. What we're witnessing is a slow but seismic reversal. For decades, Canadian aluminum flowed into American factories. Now those factories may start flowing toward Canada. The infrastructure is there, the political climate is favorable, and every day that these tariffs remain, the business case for relocating becomes harder to ignore. This is no longer just about Coca-Cola. It's about where the next generation of North American manufacturing will happen and who will lead it. Canada isn't winning with flashy headlines. It's winning quietly, methodically, and decisively.
No, I think everyone has seen elasticities which are on the more favorable end in terms of the consumer spending money. I think there's clearly an effect going on here of, on the one hand, inflation is running ahead of wage growth, which should lead to a reduction in purchasing power.
And the longer the U.S. clings to uncertainty, the more companies will choose the quiet road north. For American manufacturers hoping to sidestep the aluminum tariff crisis, the alternatives aren't just limited, they're costly, and in many cases, unworkable. The idea of shifting from aluminum to plastic bottles might seem like an obvious fix, but Coca-Cola and other beverage producers know it's anything but simple. Switching to PET plastic requires completely retooling, filling, and packaging lines, a process that demands millions in capital investment and months, if not years, of transition time. And even then, it comes with a reputational cost. Many consumers view plastic as a step backward in sustainability, and companies risk alienating environmentally conscious buyers in the process. Glass, that's no silver bullet either. It's heavier, more fragile, and more expensive to transport. While it may carry an air of nostalgia, it simply can't compete with aluminum in terms of cost efficiency or scalability. In reality, aluminum remains the most effective packaging material for shelf-stable beverages. And that makes the 50% tariff not just an inconvenience, but a strategic blow to the industry's core. That leaves many companies with a harsh dilemma: absorb the cost or raise prices. But passing the hike onto customers is a gamble. There's only so much consumers are willing to pay before they switch brands or stop buying altogether. For smaller players without the scale of Coca-Cola or Pepsi, the margin for error is razor thin. Meanwhile, the broader supply chain is starting to buckle. The Can Manufacturers Institute reports that bottlenecks in aluminum sourcing are now bleeding into other sectors, delaying unrelated imports like hops, tea, and even basic grocery staples. Logistics networks are being strained by reprioritized cargo, and retailers are already bracing for gaps on shelves and late arrivals. In short, there is no clear, scalable solution on the table. The most obvious fixes are too expensive, too slow, or too politically sensitive to pursue, and all the while the tariff clock keeps ticking. America's aluminum problem has become something much bigger. It's a test of how quickly and how wisely companies can respond to geopolitical pressure. But right now, that response is stalling. And the longer it takes, the more it reveals a painful truth: the world's most powerful economy just stumbled over its own supply chain. Behind the headlines and press conferences, a quieter shift is already underway. American companies, large and small, are quietly hitting pause, halting expansion plans, freezing hiring, and seriously weighing whether future production should happen on U.S. soil at all. It's not just about Coca-Cola anymore. The uncertainty triggered by the aluminum tariffs has rattled confidence across entire sectors, forcing executives to rethink long-held assumptions about where and how they do business. And while American firms hesitate, the rest of the world is starting to respond. Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, three of America's closest trade partners, are beginning to reevaluate their own economic alignment. Canada has already voiced strong opposition to the tariffs and backed it up with targeted trade incentives. Mexico is signaling interest in absorbing more North American manufacturing, and the EU has warned it may retaliate if U.S. trade policy continues down this path. In other words, the political ground beneath U.S. supply chains is starting to shift, and not in Washington's favor. What's taking shape is a slow, subtle industrial migration. It's not a mass exodus yet, but it's happening. One plant considering relocation, one contract renegotiated offshore, one supply chain rerouted through Canada instead of the U.S. These aren't dramatic moves, but they add up. And while U.S. policymakers focus on the headline numbers, Canada has already set the table ready with financing tools, trade stability and infrastructure to welcome whatever business quietly slips across the border. This is what a modern economic realignment looks like, not with factory sirens and public layoffs, but with closed-door strategy meetings, paused investments, and job postings that never go live. The aluminum tariff may have been designed to protect American industry, but piece by piece, decision by decision, it's helping dismantle it instead. If Coca-Cola, a global icon, an American brand as embedded in U.S. culture as baseball and apple pie, is now considering moving operations out of the United States, the question writes itself, who will stay? If a company with nearly unlimited resources, political access, and deep domestic infrastructure still can't weather this trade storm, what chance do smaller manufacturers have? The aluminum tariffs were framed as a strategy to protect American industry. But after months of rising costs, stalled hiring, and talks of relocation, it's fair to ask, are these policies protecting anything or slowly suffocating the very industries they were meant to save? From soda and soup to jobs and investments, the cost of protectionism is starting to feel less like a shield and more like a burden. And then comes the hardest truth of all. It's not just companies paying the price. It's consumers, it's workers, it's the family buying a six-pack of soda that now costs more than it used to. How much are Americans willing to pay for the idea of buying American? And when does that patriotic premium become too high to justify? Is paying more for the same soda really helping American workers, or just pushing their jobs somewhere else? If this story matters to you, don't stay silent. Share this video and subscribe for more breaking news.